trial. So, okay. If you guys remember last class, I started out with a video. It was a AOPA safety video, kind of outline a few topics that we were going to cover during the class. I'm not going to do that in the beginning this time because I think, at least I feel that this particular video would be more productive at the end. So I'm going to try to end about 15 minutes early so we can watch the video and then use some of the concepts that we discussed during the class to review in the safety video. I think it'll make for some good discussion at the end. So if that's okay with you guys, I'm gonna jump right into the material.
Sure.
Alrighty, and you guys can hear me pretty good?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome. All right. So this session we're going to focus on aircraft systems. It's probably, when it comes to flying an airplane and particularly emergency situations, this material here happens to become the most useful, I'll say, in knowing what the airplane's doing, how it's behaving internally with regard to the electrical system, the aircraft engine, the fuel system, etc. It's not until you have an urgent situation in flight, whether that be significantly urgent, like your engine stops working, or just your aircraft's doing something funny. It's not until that moment when you realize you wish you knew the intricacies of the aircraft a little bit better. And furthermore, what I will say too is after you guys go off and get your certificates and start flying, this material is pretty much the first material that you forget about right away. And it's true. You'll have when I went to get my instrument rating, they focus on this stuff just as much as they do during the private, and it's like, wow, completely forget what to, the sequence of events if your engine stops working. Have to pull the checklist out and read it 5 times type thing. So this is really a foundational groundwork for stuff that you want to commit to memory more or less. So let me, I'm going to share screen here and we'll get going. All right. Yeah, I'm going to blow it up. I've got, all right. How's that look for everybody?
Readable.
Okay, so like I said, we're gonna work our way through the entire aircraft, fuel systems, the engine itself, induction system, the propeller, and different areas that you're going to want to become familiar with, not only for your written test, but when you get your certificate, and then obviously flying the aircraft thereafter. We're going to start with the engine. It's really, when you look at the airplane, the engine, the electrical system are 2 of the highest level paramount systems within the aircraft that you're going to get to know intimately during your flight training and your future flying. Aircraft engines have really come a long way over the past 80 to 90 years. The first reciprocating or piston-driven aircraft engines were actually inline engines. And you guys may be familiar with inline engines from your vehicle. Inline piston engines are a popular small car engine design, and aircraft engines juned with inline designs and matured to radial designs. If you are like a World War II aircraft junkie, you'll know that a lot of aircraft in that time period used radial engines. But fast forward to today, and aircraft engines are predominantly, for your light aircraft, are predominantly opposing engines. Do you guys know what that term might mean, opposed engine?
Based upon that picture, it looks like the pistons are on opposite sides of each other.
That's right. That's exactly right. It's kind of like take your typical V, like your V8 or V6 engine, and then just dump the angle down to completely in line, and you can see these cylinders are completely opposing each other. They're not in line with each other. They're not in a V configuration. They're opposed. One of them's shooting out to the east, the other one's shooting out to the west. And in your flying, 99% of your small piston aircraft engines are going to be opposed. I can't even off the top of my head think of a V engine layout in today's general aviation aircraft. And furthermore, they are predominantly going to be 4-stroke or 4-cycle engines. Do you guys, I'm not familiar, I know Emily knows some engine stuff, but do you guys know what the 2 versus 4-stroke is?
I could take a guess, but that's about it.
Yeah, I don't know.
Okay, let's blow this up because this will help answer it. Now, just keep in mind, this stuff, and Chris, this is probably just a warning for you because we talked about this last time. We can totally geek out on this stuff. We can get as deep as we want. I'll try to keep it at a respectable level because the goal here is to learn and get the material down. But a 4-stroke engine completes the 4 critical engine operations in separate strokes. The intake, where the outside air comes into the cylinder, is 1 stroke. The compression of that air is a 2nd stroke, meaning the piston goes from its bottom position to its top position, compresses the air. The 3rd stroke is where the spark plug emits a spark, which ignites the fuel and air mixture. And then the 4th stroke is the piston returning to its top position and expelling the exhaust out of the cylinder. In a 2-stroke arrangement, those 4 operations occur in 2 strokes, not 4. So your intake and your exhaust occur at the same time, and your compression and your power stroke occur at the same time. 2-stroke engines are almost non-existent in general aviation aircraft. So for the purposes of studying and knowing your material and being a safe pilot, the 4-stroke or the 4-cycle engine is what you're going to be flying.
Is there a reason why that they typically aren't 2-stroke? Is it a power generation problem? Is it a mechanical risk?
It 2 reasons. One, a cost and maintenance.
Wow.
Parts are significantly more available for the 4-stroke engine. And secondly, power to weight ratio. There's more ports. There's more like exhaust headers on a 2-stroke engine, so it's going to be heavier, and so you're not going to get as much bang for your buck out of a 2-stroke engine.
Got it.
Yep. And so really the bottom line before I dump this picture down is as these cycles take place, the intake, compression, power, exhaust, this crankshaft here at the bottom, which is pushing the piston up and down, is rotating the whole time, which we're going to learn here in a minute is what eventually turns your propeller. So as this piston is firing, and in the case of this engine here in the picture, 4 pistons are firing in different sequences. It's going to turn the crankshaft, which is hooked up to the front end of that propeller right there. All right. Any questions on the engine cycles or the engine itself?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, good question. I got a slide on that. Emily asked about the cooling. As you guys know, your car engine has a radiator, and so therefore our car engines are liquid cooled. You have to put coolant in the radiator, or you can put water in the radiator. Aircraft engines, general aviation aircraft engines, are air cooled, meaning they rely on the passing of air going through the engine cowling to keep it at a nominal temperature. And we're gonna learn in a couple slides here that this has significant impact on the operation of the engine and how you fly the airplane, and what you have to look out for when you're piloting the aircraft. And we'll come back to that cooling here in a second. Let's jump over to the prop. Aircraft propeller. So the prop is really just it's an airfoil. If you guys have ever looked at a propeller from the top down to the hub, you'll notice that it actually has a fat surface and a flat surface, and if you look even closer, you'll notice the surface, the surface pointing away from the aircraft, actually gets fatter. So the prop has a different angle of attack as you get to the hub of the propeller. The propeller literally works just like a helicopter rotor, and it works just like the wings of the aircraft do. As it spins, it generates lift, and that lift pushes or pulls the aircraft in the perpendicular direction the prop's pointing. You see the note there about angle of attack. What venture a quick guess? Why do you guys think the angle of attack? Let me blow this up here. Why do you guys think the angle of attack changes along the length of the airfoil or along the length of the prop?
Because of the shape of the prop?
Say that again.
Because of the shape of the prop?
Okay. Why does it change though? What physical characteristic of the prop itself? Why would it actually start over here with 0 angle of attack and go all the way to like a very positive angle of attack?
That's how you push wind?
True. So remember from last lesson, the greater the angle of attack, what goes up when you increase angle of attack?
Lift?
Yes, exactly. What goes down as you increase angle of attack?
Lift?
No. There you go. Speed.
Speed.
Airspeed, right? If you pull, and I'm kind of reaching to the last chapter. So Chris, if this is something we haven't gone over yet, but as you increase the angle of attack and you climb, airspeed is going to slow down, right? So to generate the same amount of lift, you've got to increase the angle of attack for slower airspeed. That's why the prop has a different angle of attack along its length, because as it spins, the outside of the prop over here spins faster than the inside. And you want the prop to generate the same amount of lift along its entire length.
Got it. Interesting.
Yep. So the hub here, call it this red region right here, is spinning slower than the blue region. So in order to maintain constant, call it quote unquote lift, constant thrust, it has to have a higher angle of attack closer to the hub. And this is a segue into different propeller designs. But before I jump there, I want to make one point and then make sure everybody understands the angle of attack notion. One point I want to make is, and I highlight this in blue because when you guys go take your real flight training, go fly airplanes, you're going to be doing pre-flight inspections. The propeller, if you had to pick only 3 areas of the airplane to inspect before taking it for a flight, the propeller would be one of them. You want to ensure that the propeller surface is free of defects and cracks. You'll notice where cracks have been repaired before and blended out with a power tool. But like in this picture here, that's a significant crack in that prop. I would not fly the airplane. The prop is subject to significant forces in flight. It's very significant, thousands of pounds of force. So if you had to pick a couple items to pre-flight, that would be one of them. Okay, everybody understand any questions on the angle of attack notion there? Makes sense?
Just to repeat, you said with the angle of attack goes down, speed goes down, right?
As the speed decreases, if you want to generate the same amount of lift, you've got to increase the angle of attack.
Got it. Yeah. Okay, I'm with you.
Yep. All right. Okay, let's talk propeller systems as kind of an introduction to different propeller design. Definitely memorize this page, and I'm gonna obviously send this pitch out. We'll put it in the shared folder. But when you guys take your flight training, you're gonna be flying an airplane that has a fixed pitch propeller. And what does that mean? Fixed pitch, very simply, the pitch of the propeller stays the same. You cannot change it in flight. The only way you could change the pitch of the propeller is if you put a new propeller on the airplane. And I put a picture of a wooden propeller down here because that's an obvious one. You can't, in flight, the pitch of the propeller is going to stay the same. This brings up a couple different challenges when it comes to flying airplanes. Can anybody venture a guess at what one of the downsides of having a fixed pitch propeller would be?
Your propeller gets cracked and you can't fix it in flight?
Well, no. Well, if it's fixed, what I mean by fixed pitch is you can't change the angle. Here, let me go back here. So this particular propeller in the picture, it's always going to have these angle of attacks. It's always going to have the same shape, no matter what. It's a solid piece of metal or perhaps wood, like it is in this picture. But you're not going to be able to change the pitch in flight, as opposed to there is such thing as a what's called a constant speed, or a variable pitch propeller, meaning you can actually from the cockpit change the pitch of the propeller. But one of the reasons fixed pitch is I'll say not as good of a configuration as constant speed is because the propeller, when you're climbing, you're going to want to have a different angle of attack when you're climbing than when you're flying straight and level. When you're climbing the airplane and you've got full power and you're trying to gain as much altitude as you can in a short period of time, you're going to want a propeller that has a relatively low blade angle. You're going to want that propeller to be able to cut through the air extremely easily. If that propeller had a significant blade angle and you were trying to climb in the airplane, it would cut the air too much, and the engine would not be able to run at a high RPM. Does that make sense?
Yes, I think so.
Emily's kind of shaking her head.
So say that again, though. Like you want, when you're trying to climb with increased power, you want what shape of propeller? Like you want to, you said a.
Yeah. So the propeller, think it. Let me make this statement first. The propeller is resisting, because the airplane's flying through air, through a fluid. The propeller is resisting the power the engine's putting out. Right. That's what causes the propeller to pull the airplane. So if you're flying through air and the propeller has a significant blade angle, meaning a high angle of attack, it's going to be cutting through the air, and it's gonna put a lot of stress on the engine. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. If you were to flatten that blade angle, and let's just go to the extreme, let's give the prop 0 angle. It's just a paddle in the air. It's going to cut through the air very easily. There's not going to be hardly any resistance except for the 0 angle of attack blade going through the air. So your engine is going to be able to run at a higher power setting because of that. There's less drag on the engine because, like I said before, the prop and the engine are connected. You know, they're on the crankshaft.
Okay.
Does that make sense for everybody?
I think so.
So if you increase the blade angle, it's going to cut through the air more. The air is going to create more drag on the propeller. Thus, the propeller creates more drag on the engine. The engine can't run as high of RPM as it can when the blade was at 0 angle. Make sense, Emily?
Yes.
Got it. Emily, Chris, does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So getting back to the fixed pitch and the point I was making about the cruise versus climb, the one element of a fixed pitch propeller, meaning a propeller that we cannot change the blade angle, the one downside to that is you've got one blade angle to use through all your flight configurations: climb, cruise, descent, emergency, flying upside down, what have you, right? Whereas if you've got a propeller where you can change the blade angle, you can optimize the blade angle for the type of flight that you're in. So if I'm in climb, if I'm climbing the aircraft, I want maximum power from the engine. If I want maximum power from the engine, I want minimal drag from my propeller. Minimal drag from my propeller would be a low blade angle. As opposed to cruise, if I'm in cruise, I don't need maximum engine power. I need cruise engine power. So I can actually increase my blade angle, cut more of the air, and at the end of the day, what you'll find is the aircraft travels faster that way. So if I look at this setup here down at the bottom of the screen, I've got my prop, which is fixed pitch. I cannot change the pitch. It's connected directly to the crankshaft of the engine. As we said before, the pistons drive the crankshaft, which drives the prop. And then I've got my throttle input here. And that throttle input manages the amount of fuel-air mixture that enters the cylinders, just like the throttle on your lawnmower works or the gas pedal on your car works. And then I've got my tachometer, which is an indication of engine power. What questions do you guys have?
When you say engine power, is that RPMs?
Mm-hmm. Yes, it is. Yep. Revolutions per minute, which is direct relationship to engine power. Yep.
So the throttle controls the fuel air mixture, but the mixture controls
just the fuel. And the question was, throttle controls fuel air mixture, mixture controls just the fuel. And we're going to get into that in a couple slides. So table that for just 2 seconds.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Complex aircraft have what are called constant speed propeller systems. Constant speed propeller systems is synonymous with adjustable pitch propeller, meaning in flight from the cockpit, you can adjust the pitch of the propeller based on the configuration of flight that you're in. As I mentioned before, when you're climbing, you want the engine to produce its maximum power available, meaning your throttle's going to be all the way 100%. You're going to want the blade angle of the prop to be extremely small so that there's not a lot of air drag on the crankshaft, meaning the engine is able to RPM at extremely high RPMs, as high as it can go. The constant speed propeller system, it solves the climb versus the cruise issue of a fixed pitch. A fixed pitch propeller isn't really built efficiently for cruise or climb. It's kind of in the middle. For a constant speed system, the aircraft is going to find the best propeller blade angle for the RPM that the pilot sets. Now, constant speed systems are a complex aircraft system. You will not need to demonstrate how to fly a constant speed propeller system as a private pilot. But you will be expected to at least explain during the test the difference between a fixed pitch and an adjustable or a variable pitch propeller. Let me talk a little bit about how the pilot controls the propeller, just from the pilot's perspective, because there is I would say a little bit of a confusing point when it comes to constant speed prop systems.
Yeah, I've always wanted to know how this works, so I'm excited about this.
So from the pilot's perspective, it's tough because you have to understand it from the pilot's perspective, and you have to understand it from the propeller's perspective, because they're extremely confusing. From the pilot's perspective, in the cabin, he's going to select an RPM that he wants to operate at. and he's going to go to the tachometer for that RPM. That's where he's going to find that RPM. He's going to find that RPM by adjusting the prop control. This blue, it's basically a lever in the cockpit that looks just like the throttle, except the handle's blue. Unlike the fixed pitch system here, where the throttle is a direct contributor to your RPMs, meaning if I want 100% throttle, I'm going to get max power, max RPMs. Pull the throttle all the way back, very little RPMs, very little power. Here in the cockpit of a constant speed system, the prop control performs that. Essentially, you push the prop control full forward, and you're going to get maximum RPMs. You pull it all the way back, you're going to get minimum RPMs. You're going to get low RPMs. Now, from the propeller side of things, when it sees the full prop forward, it goes into a low angle of attack mode, a climb mode. Because why? Because the high RPM means the prop needs to be, like we said before, creating little drag through the air. It needs to be cutting as little air as possible to let the engine have as much power as possible. And then when you pull the prop control back, the blue propeller control back for low RPM, you're going to get a very high angle of attack blade angle on the prop. Does that make sense? The prop control?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And then the throttle in the constant speed system does the same thing that it does in the fixed system. It controls the fuel air mixture entering the cylinders. Except in the case of the constant speed system with the variable pitch propeller, moving the throttle back and forth does not affect your RPMs. The propeller control does.
Yep.
So so if you go to the extremes, and so let me discuss one extreme. You're cruising along and you decide that you're going to just pull all throttle back. Let's say maybe you have an emergency, or what have you. You pull the throttle all the way back, but you keep your propeller control all the way forward. So what's the engine going to do? The engine is going to see that as there's less fuel air coming in the engine. The engine's going to slow. It's going to initially have less power output. The piston and cylinders are going to be providing less power output because there's less fuel air, right? The constant speed system is going to see that, but it wants to hold a constant RPM. Why? Because the pilot had set his RPM to some number. It's called 2,500. And this propeller system is going to want to hold that 25. So now we've got a conflict. The prop wants to hold 25, but the engine's telling it to slow down. So what's the prop going to do?
Adjust.
Yeah, it's gonna try to speed up, right? It's gonna say, oh no, the engine wants the RPMs to go down because the pilot pulled the throttle, but I'm gonna try to keep it at 2,500 RPM. So it's going to adjust the blade angle to a low angle of attack.
Yeah.
Now it's going to get to a point, and they call this in the system, it's called a stop. It's called a propeller stop. It's going to get to a point where it cannot get any flatter. The propeller can't go any lower in blade angle. And then what happens? The RPMs start going down. Does that make sense?
So the prop will adjust on its own even if you have it all the way forward?
Absolutely. The constant speed system is designed to hold an RPM value. to the extent that it can. This is, I don't expect you guys to get this the first time. This is a very complex item, and it's not necessarily a private pilot item, but I wanted to teach it because it could come up, fixed pitch versus variable pitch.
No, you can always tell when you're in a variable pitch prop because you can hear it as it changes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you know, the other extreme, we talked about the extreme of pulling the throttle all the way back. The other extreme is if you had the throttle full forward, but the propeller control all the way back, right? So you're telling the engine, I want 100% maximum power because I've got the throttle all the way up. I'm dumping fuel and air into the cylinders at the highest rate I can. But the prop controls all the way back. I'm telling the prop I want a low RPM configuration. So what's the prop going to do?
Higher blade angle.
Yeah, it's going to go to a very high blade angle because it sees all that power coming from the engine, but it wants to hold the RPMs down at like 1,000 or 1,500. So it's going to try to restrict the amount of, or it's going to try to increase the amount of drag that the prop sees so the engine doesn't increase RPM. Now, just like in the previous example, it's going to hit a stop to the point where it cannot keep the RPMs from going up. The RPMs will eventually go up in that scenario. Okay?
Yep.
Make good sense? All right. One more quick note on props, because this is something that will come up on the tests and on the flight tests and stuff. And again, it's something that you kind of forget until you have to take a flight review or until you have to, prove that you're a safe pilot to an examiner. But the propeller is aerodynamically the cause of several, I'll call it different nuances of aerodynamics. There's four in particular, one of which on the bottom right is the most pronounced. But the prop causes four phenomenons: torque, slipstream, precession, and what's called P factor. I didn't label it. I apologize. But on the bottom right here, this is called P factor. The torque reaction is relatively simple. Newton's, is it third law, where the prop's spinning clockwise, so by consequence the airframe, what it's attached to, wants to spin counterclockwise. So when you're flying along and you go from low power setting to high power setting in an instant, you're going to feel that airplane kind of rock to the left a little bit. Slipstream is the aerodynamic phenomenon of the air rotating around the fuselage, hitting the underside of the left wing, hitting the top side of the right wing, hitting the underside of the elevator, left elevator, top side of the right elevator, wanting to spin the airplane a little bit to the right. Precession. How well do you guys know gyroscopes?
I'm familiar with what they are.
Yeah. I'll send out a link after class because this is ripe for a YouTube video. A gyroscope is a spinning wheel in its simplest form, and when you push on it, when you push on one of the rims, it wants to turn 90 degrees. So any force that acts on a spinning object, like a propeller, is going to want it to push a force perpendicular to the direction it's spinning. So propeller precession is a tail up force caused by high power output of the propeller. I'll be honest with you guys, this force you can't really feel. Yeah, this one is not a big force. And like I said, I'll send out a gyroscope video later on. You guys can check it out. You'll get a feel for what that perpendicular force means. And then P factor. P factor is the most pronounced force. And essentially what it is as the aircraft is climbing, it does happen a little bit in straight and level flight, but you can't notice it until you're climbing. As the aircraft climbs, the load on the upward propeller blade is less than the load on the downward propeller blade. And that causes the downward propeller blade to create more lift, call it, and it wants to turn the aircraft to the left. So if you're the pilot and you're looking straight out of the airplane, the downward propeller blade swings from your 12 o'clock to your 3 o'clock, and then your 3 o'clock to your 6 o'clock. From that 3 to 6, the blade in that particular point of travel is creating more lift than the blade that's traveling from 6 to 12, 6, 9, 12. And that causes more lift, and it causes the aircraft to yaw ever so slightly to the left. And to give you an idea how much it turns the aircraft, for every, I would say, 10 miles you travel or climb, you'll probably end up about a mile off course. So it's pretty significant if you don't correct for it.
Say that again. For how much do you end up a mile?
For every 10 miles you travel forward, you'll end up about 1 mile off of your intended straight path. So it's my point being it's extremely pronounced. Yeah, so if my airplane's straight path is that right there, if I don't correct for this left-hand turning tendency caused by that propeller phenomenon called P factor, I'm actually going to end up here. About a mile off course, off my straight line course.
Wow.
Yeah, it's extremely pronounced. And what you guys will find when you start your flight training, it's extremely important to consider P factor in the traffic pattern. Why? Because you're taking off full power, you're climbing at the aircraft's maximum climbing capability. So the P factor is going to be its worst. And there's other airplanes in the traffic pattern. You want to keep your traffic pattern a rectangle. So you will always correct for the P factor. All right, any questions on the 4 different types of propeller aerodynamic phenomenon?
Do these conditions increase linearly when you add more engines? Or does it change completely when you move the engine from the nose to the wings?
So to answer your first question, no, I'm pretty sure it's not linear. Especially P factor is probably not linear. It's probably, and I say the word probably because I'd have to look this up, but it's likely more pronounced at high speed and very unnoticeable at, say, middle RPM. At 2,500 RPM on a typical general aviation engine, you'll notice it. At 2,200, you'll kind of notice it, and at 2,000, you'll hardly notice it. So it's probably not linear.
Okay.
And your second question, for multi-engine aircraft, the propellers actually, in later design engines, propellers actually spin opposite each other to cancel out some of these effects.
Makes sense.
So when the plane's descending, does it have a right word?
No, and the reason for that is it's only pronounced in high power settings. Yeah, it's only when the propeller is call it spinning as fast as it can, or spinning, or RPM. Sorry about that. The question, Emily's question was, does it happen in descent? And the answer to that is no, or not typical, because it's a high power configuration. P factor is a high power configuration phenomenon when the prop is spinning its highest.
Okay.
All right. So we started with the engine and the prop. We talked about those major systems. Let's go into the engine a little bit and talk about carburetors and fuel injectors, or what I guess what's more officially termed the induction system. How the engine receives fuel and air mixture to create combustion, to take chemical energy and convert it into mechanical energy. I would say probably about 50 to 60% of your general aviation aircraft today utilize a carburetor. I highly doubt any of us have carbureted engines. I know, Alan, I know your vehicles are fuel injected. Emily, I don't know, Chris, what you drive, but it's probably fuel injected.
BMW, I don't know.
Probably when did they stop putting carburetors in engines? Like mid 70s. So I don't want to judge anybody, but anyway, aircraft still employ carburetors. And you'll see them out there, and it's important to know this stuff, because carburetors actually require certain, I'll call it, operating behavior from the pilot that fuel injected systems do not. There's two kinds of carbureted systems. There's what's called a float type carburetor, and there's what's called a pressure type carburetor. I have not come across a pressure type carburetor in my flying. It's typically reserved for more expensive, larger aircraft, and as we all know, larger aircraft are today using turbine engines, turboprops. They're not using piston engines as much. So you're going to only come across float type carburetors. What's the difference? The float carburetor employs a float inside what's called the float chamber here. Let me blow this up. And that float, it meters the amount of fuel entering what's called the discharge nozzle. And it's very simple. The float, when it reaches a certain angle, let's picture this float moving down as the fuel leaves the chamber. It stops the flow of fuel into the injection nozzle, or into what's called the venturi here. Once the engine needs more fuel and the float reaches a certain height, it'll start to discharge fuel again into the nozzle. So it simply works on gravity. It's calibrated, and then it works on gravity to feed fuel into the nozzle. The pressure carburetor doesn't utilize a float. Instead, it utilizes a fuel pump that's driven by the engine. That's as much as I'll say about that, because it's probably won't run across it. You're not going to be asked about it on your tests, but if you're asked about the differences, just know that the pressure type is utilizing a fuel pump instead of a float. Now, your first thought, what's everybody's first thought when they think about this float system here? I know what mine is. What's everybody's first thought?
Toilet.
Toilet, yeah, that's right. Hey, you know what? That's exactly, it's the same thing. It's the same concept. I'm glad you said that. Emily said not adjustable, which is also correct. It's not adjustable, but assuming you won't have to adjust it if it was calibrated properly.
How does it?
Yeah, go ahead.
How would it? It sounds like you can't do inverted flight.
Hey, boom, there you go. I wouldn't say you. It's not that you can't do it.
Sustain.
Yeah, you can't sustain it, and the float type systems just do not like abrupt maneuvering. If you saw an airplane and you had to do a tight turn or you had to dive or it's all gravity based. So it's like if you left a pencil on top of the dashboard and you dove the airplane, well, the pencil would go flying, right?
Mm-hmm.
Same deal. Literally, you do something crazy with your airplane, and the engine will probably stop momentarily, which is just not. Highly likely it'll start up again, but it's just not a good feeling, right?
Sure.
So yeah, that's one of the, I would say, bigger items. I can't remember a time when, of course, you don't do a lot of crazy maneuvering, but it's totally possible. The other downside to, well, not just float type carburetors, but carburetors in general, is they are extremely susceptible to freezing or icing. And we'll for this discussion here, we'll kind of geek out and talk about temperatures and pressures and Bernoulli's principle again.
When you say they're susceptible to icing, is that in flight or when they're on the ground?
Well,
or both?
Technically both, but what you'll find is on the ground, tough to identify. Okay. In flight, easier to identify. The prop's spinning at a higher RPM. The engine's usually going at a higher RPM than when you're on the ground. So when the carburetor ices up and you start to struggle from a fuel-air mixture perspective, you're gonna identify it a little bit easier in the air. And let's talk about ice. Let's talk about how the conditions. How the carburetor is more susceptible to icing and what conditions are required. Over here, for our engineering types, for our scientists, does anybody recognize that equation at all? Chris, I am unaware exactly of your background, but if anybody has had any science schooling, you'll know that this is what's called the ideal gas equation.
Okay.
And we are not going to geek out too much, but what I will tell you is what this equation basically says, and you're going to use it, FYI, you're going to use this equation everywhere in flying. You'll use it here. We're going to use it when we talk about weather. We could have used it in last lesson talking about aerodynamics because it definitely applies. But basically what it says is as pressure goes up on one side of the equation, something else on this side has to go up for them to stay equal. And the only non-constant item on this side of the equation is temperature. So this equation governs how pressure and temperature behave in a fluid, in a gas or a fluid. If you keep a constant volume, if your pressure goes up, your temperature is going to go up. If your pressure goes down, your temperature is going to go down. How does that apply to the carburetor? Well, and if I start geeking out too much, guys, stop me, please. But as the incoming air comes in through the throat of the carburetor here, and you can see the direction that it goes, the area you can see gets constricted. It goes from a high cross-sectional area to a throat or a low cross-sectional area. As long as there's no leaks, as long as the volume stays the same, there's no leaks or the air's not escaping somewhere else. You remember from last time, the velocity increases, and what does the pressure do?
Goes down.
Goes down. Yes, highly Highly counterintuitive, but the pressure goes down. And if the pressure goes down, according to this equation over here, what does the temperature do?
Goes down.
It goes down. And if you're flying in air, which is the only thing you'll ever fly in, and there's moisture content in the air and the temperature goes down far enough, you get ice.
So like high altitude flying.
That's right. Absolutely. High altitude flying. It can even be low altitude flying if the conditions are right. The reason for that is because the temperature drop across the venturi throat is so drastic. You can literally take ambient 70-degree air that's coming in through the induction system, and you can lower that all the way through freezing, through 32 degrees Fahrenheit. It's a lot more common than you think.
Wow.
Yep. So the one thing you're going to want to become familiar with, that's the science behind it. But from a practicality standpoint, what you're going to want to become familiar with is just like Alan talked about, the flight conditions. What conditions will you fly through where carburetor icing is likely? And I've got a couple of graphs up here, just different ways to look at it. But if somebody asks you, if an examiner asks you, or if a passenger wants to know, your answer is going to be high humidity, high moisture content, and anywhere between 70 degrees Fahrenheit and below. And high moisture content is 80% humidity, 80% relative humidity and up. But as you can see from here, and this chart here is not something I created. This has been, studied and scientist input. But, carburetor icing possible anywhere from 100 F down to 20 F and 50% humidity and up. So as you can see, it can really happen in like 90% of the flight envelope.
Wow.
When your carburetor ices up, your engine receives less fuel-air mixture, right? Go back to the picture here. As the throat closes, your engine starts to see less fuel-air mixture. And what is the result of that?
Say it again? Sorry.
As your carburetor ices up, your cylinders receive less fuel-air mixture.
Right.
What's the result of that?
Decreased power.
Decreased power, yeah.
Which has decreased flight capabilities, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean,
so it's not pulling you as well, which has all kinds of down.
Right. From the pilot's perspective, your engine can run rough all the way up to the other extreme. Your engine quits running. I mean, rough to quits running, basically. And so, so aircraft with carburetors are equipped with carburetor heaters. Because you're looking at this flight envelope here. Man, I could fly in 100-degree Fahrenheit weather at 90% humidity, and my carburetor ices up. Well, that's it's like every airplane. that flight envelope's so wide. Every aircraft with a carburetor is going to have a carburetor heater, which is activated from the cockpit. And you're going to be using that carb heat in the flight conditions which are susceptible to carb icing, which is your high humidity, middle temperature range. When I flew aircraft with carburetors, if it was winter time with 100, with 70 to 100% humidity, which is kind of rare, but yeah, that thing would be on. And if it wasn't on, my ear was peeled to potential rough engine operations. All right. Any carburetor questions?
No, not now.
Yep. Chances are, especially nowadays and going forward, you're going to fly an airplane with a fuel injector system. I don't think I've flown a carbureted engine. It's been carbureted engine's been a while. They're definitely being, they're phasing out. If you buy an airplane today, it'll definitely have a fuel injected system on it. But fuel injected systems is similar to the carburetor. It essentially uses what's called a fuel air mixture control unit, which mixes the fuel and the air together and sends it to the cylinders. The one major difference being that the charge, the fuel air mixture leaving the control unit is already mixed. It doesn't have to go through a venturi and become mixed. It's already mixed when it reaches what's called the fuel manifold valve up here. So consequently, fuel injected systems are really not susceptible to icing at all. So you'll not have rough engines, or your engine won't stop due to a fuel system icing condition past the fuel air control unit, because there's no venturi, there's no pressure drop, there's no temperature drop. You can also do all the perform all the aerobatics you want, because it's a pressure similar to a pressure carbureted system. There's a fuel pump which provides constant fuel pressure, so you could flip the airplane and it's not going to. There's no gravity implications on the system itself, on the control unit. Now, take note of this, because there is a little bit of trickery on the FAA written test that you may run into, and I'll try to include it on the quiz. But one of the questions asks if the fuel injected induction system is susceptible to icing. True or false? There's not a true or false question, and the first thing you think about, because Adam taught you that it's not, your first answer was no, it's not. Well, the induction system starts not just at the doesn't just start at the fuel control unit, and it doesn't just start at the carburetor, but it starts actually where the air enters the induction system or the aircraft. Similar to how your car engine collects its air for the fuel air mixture, the airplane has what's called a ram air input on the front of on the front of most aircraft. I should have put a picture in here, but and it can ice over, but I would consider that airframe icing. Most people would consider that airframe icing, but the FAA, if the air induction ices over on the outside of the airplane, they consider that induction icing. So just be careful of that trickery when someone tries to get you to say that a fuel injector system can get iced over. All right. That's induction systems. I want to talk a little bit more about fuel systems, but any questions on carburetors or fuel injectors?
We're more likely to fly a fuel injected system, correct?
Oh yeah, yeah, most airplanes you're going to fly these days will be fuel injected. If you fly a carbureted engine, it was probably built before 1985 and just hasn't been retrofitted or whatever.
Okay.
Yep. Now, I'll be honest with you. From a training perspective, it's great to learn how to fly one, because you just never know. You could totally legally learn how to fly, get certificated, become a professional pilot in an airplane or a bunch of airplanes with fuel injected systems, and then one day someone asks you to fly them in a carbureted system, and you could totally legally fly that airplane. So it doesn't hurt when you're going through your flight training to ask your instructor, hey, let's go fly a carbureted aircraft, just because you have to know how to operate the carburetor heat system.
Interesting.
Yep. All right. Diving into, I'm doing a time check here, and we are like almost right on schedule. Diving into fuel systems a little bit more. Now, you're like, well, isn't the induction system, isn't that part of the fuel system? Well, it is, but for the purposes of the FAA and what you're going to learn through your training, the fuel system consists of the fuel tanks, the fuel lines going through some sort of selector valve. Let me blow this up here. Going through some sort of selector valve that tells the airplane which tank to use. And then making its way, eventually making its way to the engine. Most general aviation aircraft have a fuel strainer, which is in line with the fuel line, which strains out any impurities, dust, dirt, other fluids other than fuel. And then some aircraft also have what's called a primer. Now, if you've ever used a lawnmower, you might have used a primer. And what the primer does is it spits fuel into the engine prior to starting it to kind of give it some pre-starting fuel in the cylinders. Makes it a lot easier to start the engine. Now, from a general aviation perspective, you're going to run across two kinds of fuel systems. What's called a gravity-fed system, and one's called a fuel pump system, or a non-gravity system. No surprise, your gravity-fed systems are typically only going to be found in aircraft where the fuel tanks are higher than the engine, so that the fuel can use gravity to travel to the engine. And then your fuel pump system will typically be found on aircraft where the fuel tanks are either in line with or lower than the engine. So your Cessnas, your Cessnas are going to have your gravity-fed systems. Your Pipers are going to have your fuel pump systems. There are high-wing airplanes that have fuel pump systems. Totally, you'll totally run into those. They use gravity and a pump. You will not find your low-wing airplanes with gravity systems, because you're just trying to ignore the laws of physics at that point.
Say that again. When are you ignoring the laws of physics?
If you have a low-wing aircraft that uses a gravity-fed system, yeah. Yep. So I mentioned that most, if not all, aircraft have a fuel strainer. What do you guys think? Just interested to hear your guys' thoughts. What do you guys think is one or two things that you're going to want to look for during a pre-flight when you're inspecting the airplane coming out of the fuel strainer?
Water.
Yeah, man, someone's been studying. That's absolutely right. Yeah. So obviously, I guess the easy answer is anything but fuel, but there is, and it's not in this diagram, there is filters, there are fail-safe methods for dirt and objects that are bigger than like 5 microns, but there is really no way to keep water from getting into your aircraft engine unless you physically strain it and inspect the fuel tanks for water. And why don't you want water in your fuel lines?
It's kind of the antithesis to combustion.
Yes, that's right. Water doesn't combust. And if you have it in enough quantity or enough volume, yes, it will absolutely stop your aircraft engine. It will not run. And may, in fact, scrap the engine. It may damage the engine beyond repair, which, of course, if you're flying the airplane and it stops, then obviously saving your life is more of importance. But very simply, if you could only inspect a few things during your aircraft pre-flight, this is one of them. The good thing is water having a higher specific gravity and being heavier than fuel, it's going to travel all the way to the lowest point of the fuel tank, which is where the strainer is installed. And you're going to be able to very easily inspect for it. And if you pull a fuel sample, like this guy's doing right here in this picture down here, and you've got a little bit of water, and you dump it, and then you do another sample, and you got a little bit of water, you dump it, and you pull your third sample, and there's no water, almost 110% guarantee there's no water in that tank, because water is heavier than fuel, and it's going to travel all the way to that strainer. Just one other quick note on fuel systems, and we'll talk a little bit about this too when we talk about instrumentation, and I think it's 4th or 5th session. But one important, semi-important element of the fuel system is the fuel gauge. Most, if not all, aircraft have fuel gauges. They should never be trusted. And can anybody venture a guess just why? I mean, obviously your fuel gauge in your car works just fine. Why wouldn't you trust your fuel gauge in an airplane?
I mean, I could think of some flippant reasons, like don't put your life in the hands of a gauge alone.
Yeah.
But I don't have a scientific reason why not to trust it.
I mean, that's simply it, right? Emily also said, it's accurate or not, you can't trust your life with a gauge, right? And the irony behind it is, they rarely are ever accurate. Like, that is the irony behind it. When you do your flying, you're just going to kind of learn to physically inspect your tanks, meaning physically look inside the tank and verify it's at the top. And then using your watch and saying, okay, we're going flying, and I'm going to set my stopwatch for, if the tank holds 4 hours worth of fuel, I'm going to set it for 3 hours, and then I'm going to find a place to land. And I'll be honest with you, I've probably 10% of the airplanes I've flown, fuel gauges actually tell you what's going on in the tank. So, never trust fuel gauge. Always physically inspect the fuel tank before you go flying, and then set your watch based on how much fuel is burned per hour, and what your personal minimums are. The FAA is going to tell you that you need to have at least 30 minutes of fuel in the tanks when you land, but I've been flying for a few years, and that is my personal minimum's at least an hour. So,
so why?
Yeah, go. What's that?
Given just how important fuel is to the operation of an aircraft in flight, how is it that the fuel gauges are still so grossly inaccurate? Is it a problem they've just really focused on in commercial aircraft, and it's just sort of in personal flight, everybody understands that you just don't use it? It just seems strange that it would be so bad after so long.
Well, and I think that's an excellent question. I think what you find talking to commercial pilots is even commercial aircraft have really inaccurate fuel gauges. And I think the reason's twofold. This is Adam's opinions, probably get others' opinions on this too. But number one, just from day one, when you start flying airplanes, you're just taught to physically inspect gas tank and set your stopwatch. That's just, it's a fundamental piloting activity. And so that, coupled with number two, the fact that there's no regulations saying that the gauge has to be accurate. I think that just kind of like, it lands you in the position of not really caring what the fuel gauge has to say.
Got it.
Now, I'll be honest with you. If it was my airplane, I'm a perfectionist. I'm a stickler. So if a fuel gauge isn't working in my airplane, I own the airplane, I own the maintenance on it, I'm going to fix it. And I know a lot of people that are like that. But when you're starting out, you're flying and you're renting airplanes, you're renting from flight schools, you're renting from private owners. You never know what you're going to find from a aircraft from a fuel gauge standpoint. But
Okay. That makes sense.
yeah. One important pilot control aspect of the fuel system is the mixture control, and we talked about this several slides ago. I said we would table that and talk about that in a minute. The mixture control is the pilot's direct control authority on the amount of fuel being provided into the carburetor or into the fuel injector system to mix with the given amount of air. And from a definition standpoint, you want to think about weight. And the reason you want to think about weight is if you start talking about mixture, fuel air mixture in terms of volume, it gets sticky very quickly because, you know, volume changes depending on temperature and density and pressure. Simply stick to weight. So if somebody asks you, hey, what is the fuel, you know, define fuel to air mixture for your airplane, you're going to tell them, well, it's the weight of the fuel to the weight of the air entering the cylinder, entering the engine. And the pilot controls the weight of the fuel entering that mixture with the mixture control. It's the red-handled throttle-like mechanism in the cockpit. And somebody tell me why the pilot might want to control the mixture.
Because when the air is less dense, you have too much fuel.
That's right. Yes. So Emily says, if your air, and why would your air be less dense? What would cause your air to be less dense?
For higher altitude.
Yeah. So, so as you climb, and as you go from airport elevation to 10,000 feet cruise, air gets less dense. Just like the folks that you go see, you know, trying to summit Mount Everest. Why do they bring oxygen tanks? Because there's less air. Air is less dense. In a given amount of volume, there's less air. And your airplane doesn't know that. Your airplane doesn't automatically know that. So it relies on a pilot to control the fuel portion of that mixture, since the atmosphere is providing the air portion of that change. As you go up in altitude, air gets less dense. So effectively, your engine is seeing less air as you go up. Consequently, the pilot needs to make sure that the engine sees less fuel to compensate for that less air. Otherwise, you'd be dumping way too much fuel in your engine. Your engine would be running what we call rich. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And when it comes to operating the aircraft, especially when you're starting your training, your flight instructor is going to most likely operate the mixture control for you in the first, you know, dozen flights, which is important because it's definitely an element that you can get sidetracked with. Even at altitudes as low as 3,000 feet, your airplane is going to need less fuel than it needs at the surface over a period of time, just because the air is less dense at even as you hit 3,000 feet. And from the pilot's perspective, it's always important as you're doing cross-country flights or as you're, you know, going through areas where, you know, you're going to be cruising at 3,000 during the first hour and then 6,000 during the second and then 12 during the third hour, to keep an eye on your mixture, because there are consequences to operating the aircraft at the wrong mixture setting. if you let's draw out a scenario here. You go out flying one day during your training, and you take off from an airport that has a airport elevation of 1,000 feet, 1,000 feet above sea level, and you're going to be cruising to another airport, and your cruise altitude is going to be 10,000 feet. Assuming you make no adjustments for mixture, meaning you've got a full rich mixture at takeoff, and you maintain a full rich mixture throughout the flight envelope up to 10,000 feet, you're dumping way too much fuel into the engine. The engine is not physically capable of burning all the fuel that you're giving it. It's gonna burn as much as it needs based on how much air is entering the engine, but it's not gonna burn 100% of the fuel that you're giving it. So what happens to that fuel? It deposits itself on the inside of the cylinders, and it deposits itself on the spark plug and anything that's inside the cylinder. And over time, you're going to get these what they call carbon buildup or carbon deposits on your spark plugs. And over time, that'll cause the engine to run rough. It'll cause premature spark plug failure. And it will cause what's called pre-ignition. Pre-ignition is when the cylinder fires or the spark plug ignites a charge, a fuel air charge in the cylinder during a stroke when it's during an engine stroke when it's not supposed to. You guys remember those 4 strokes we talked about earlier?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Pre-ignition, when pre-ignition occurs, it means that the spark plug is actually creating a fuel air ignition outside of its ignition stroke, which is catastrophic for your engine. It means that you essentially may have 2 opposing cylinders firing at the same time, which, I mean, could cause your engine to just blow up.
That's
yeah, it's significant, and it happens over time, right? So you get this carbon buildup inside the cylinder on the spark plug. You might get a little engine roughness, but pre-ignition is a significant event, as is detonation, and I'm going to define that in just a second. On the opposite side of the spectrum, let's draw out another scenario where you're cruising at 10,000 feet. Let's say that you remembered this time to set your mixture. Your mixture is set for the 10,000 foot cruise appropriately. And you're coming into land, you get down to the field elevation and you land successfully, but then you realize that you did not adjust your mixture setting on your descent. So essentially, your fuel air mixture was appropriate for the altitude you're flying at, and as you came down to sea level or airport elevation, now the air gets more dense and you don't have enough fuel in your mixture to compensate for the increased amount of air going to your engine. So your engine's running too lean. What does this do? The fuel, from a high level, from a chemical perspective, not only does the fuel provide combustion for your engine, but it also is a cooling agent. The more fuel you dump into the engine, the cooler your engine's going to run. A little counterintuitive, right? Because you think more fuel, more combustion, more heat. But it just so happens that the more fuel you throw at your engine, the cooler it will run. Conversely, if you're not throwing enough fuel at your engine and it's still trying to maintain the same power settings, RPMs, etc., your engine's going to run extremely hot. You're going to get excessive cylinder temperatures. If your aircraft is outfitted with a cylinder temperature gauge, it's going to be in the red. And the phenomenon known as detonation is caused by excessive engine temperature operation. And the definition of detonation is when the combustion process occurs in a non-smooth when it's a rough combustion process, meaning, backfiring. Maybe there's multiple ignitions in one combustion cycle. It's not smooth. And the downside to detonation is it's caused by hot engine temperatures. It also causes more heat to be produced from the nature of it occurring. One of the things that you'll notice when you go study for your written test, you go start your flight training, detonation, pre-ignition sometimes get used in the same, in the same definition or in the same context. They are separate phenomenons, but from a flying the airplane perspective, very difficult to tell one from the other. So you're going to want to kind of earmark that and tell your FAA examiner, hey, I can tell you that too rich of a mixture causes one condition, too lean of a mixture causes another. But when I'm flying the airplane and I hear detonation, it could be pre-ignition and vice versa. What the FAA is going to expect of you is that they want you to know that pre-ignition is the out of sequence firing of the cylinder, and detonation is a lack of a smooth ignition, backfiring, that kind of thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So mixture, and I'll try to recap this at the end too, but mixture happens to be an extremely important aspect of engine cooling, and that'll be one very important, I'll say, thing that your flight instructor will teach you as you start to learn how to fly the airplane, is understanding how mixture affects the engine temperatures and such. So dive a little bit deeper in engine temperatures. Mixture is not the sole contributor to having a hot engine. You guys are familiar with oil, with lubricating oil, right? All of our cars utilize lubricating oil. The one thing that you typically will not find on an aircraft engine is a radiator. So your car has a radiator, so it is liquid cooled. An aircraft actually relies very heavily on its lubricating oil to perform the functions that lubricating oil typically performs, but also cooling the engine. And you're going to find two types of systems in your general aviation aircraft. One's called a wet system, one's called a dry system. The wet system is more common than the dry system, and the wet system is very similar to what you see in your car. You've got an oil pan, you've got what's called a sump underneath the engine where the excess oil sits, and you've got an oil pump that pressurizes the system and pumps oil from that sump throughout the different areas of the engine where it's needed. And that differs from a dry sump in that a dry sump, the sump is not attached to the engine. It's located on the firewall, or in some cases, it's not even located in the engine compartment. It's located somewhere in the airframe fuselage area. Dry sumps you'll see on bigger airplanes typically, because the oil is not only needed in the engines, but it's also needed in other areas of the aircraft. But in your typical Cessna 172 wet sump connected to the engine utilizes a engine-driven oil pump to provide pressure for the system. And so with regard to the oil system, from a pilot's perspective, what do we want to going to pay attention to? Oil pressure and oil temperature. Those are two key indicators of engine operating temperature. Now, and I'm kind of recollecting in the beginning, I talked about how when you start flying, after you get your certificate and you're taking passengers up, you're going on trips, you start to forget about some of the nuances of call it safety critical or emergency critical items. Engine oil temperature and engine oil pressure happen to be the two most critical gauges, engine gauges in the cockpit. And if they are not operating in the green, you typically have somewhere in the neighborhood of like 1 to 3 minutes to figure out where to land before your engine quits. That's why when you start learning how to fly airplanes, the pressure, oil pressure, and temperature gauges will be absolutely part of your instrument scan. You'll look at them every, I don't know, 5 minutes, maybe 10 minutes, just to ensure that your engine oil system is operating under the correct parameters. Either one operating out of the green will indicate some failure of the oil lubrication system, and will typically indicate that your system's either lost all of its oil or the pumps stopped operating. But either way, lubricating oil is the lifeblood of the engine. Immediate landing is necessary if any of these gauges are outside of their normal operating zones. We talked a little bit about engine cooling, liquid versus air. I mentioned that there's no radiators on aircraft engines. So the aircraft that we fly are all going to be air cooled. So what does that mean? It means that the air going through the cowling, by virtue of the aircraft actually traveling through the air, is going to provide the necessary cooling for the engine. Now, as it relates to flying the aircraft, can you guys venture a guess on how this would affect engine temperatures, different phases of flight?
Much cooler at higher temperatures.
Higher altitudes?
Higher altitude, yeah.
Yep. So Emily mentioned it's much cooler at higher altitudes. That's absolutely correct. You'll notice your engine will have a different operating temperature at higher altitudes just by virtue of the what's called the adiabatic lapse rate of the atmosphere. Temperatures go down as you go up. Any other flight regimes you can think of where the air cooling aspect of the engine is important to keep in mind? 115? Yeah. Well, one thing, so Emily mentioned that there could be operating temperatures that are too high for the engine. You don't typically run into that. The reason is the engine already operates at extremely high temperature, almost 400 degrees Fahrenheit. But there is one flight regime which you will typically need to keep in mind as you start your training, and that's the climb, the takeoff and climb. Oh, that was weird. Can you guys still hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Testing. We just had our electricity go off over here. Huh. All right. So during takeoff and climb, your engine is operating at max capacity, maximum power, maximum temperature. And as you're climbing, typically it's going to be at minimum airspeed almost, because you're trying to gain as much altitude as you can. And remember what we said in the first lesson, the higher your angle of attack, the lower your airspeed. So what does that mean from a cooling perspective? Less air entering the cowling. There's less air, since you're traveling slower, entering the cowling, so your engine's going to run hotter. So as you take off and climb in your airplane, you will, to the extent that you can, based on the gauges that you have, monitor engine temperatures, cylinder head temperature, and oil temperature during your climb to ensure that you're not starving the engine cowling of the necessary air to keep the engine cool. So lubrication, oil lubrication, air cooling via air going through the cowling, and mixture settings, the amount of fuel that you're introducing to the engine. Those are 3 significant contributors to engine operating temperature. Any questions on that stuff? All right, we're going to transition over to the electrical system. We're almost done talking about the engine system. But before I do, just want to quick mention that there is one auxiliary engine system known as cabin heating. Most all aircraft you fly will have a cabin heater. 90% of the cabin heaters out there are going to be what's known as a shroud or a manifold heater. And what that means is there's heat exchange occurring in a heating manifold near the engine between the engine and the cabin heater, and that cabin heater is bringing some of that exchanged heat from the engine into the cabin. Very similar way, very similar to how your car heater works. As you know, sometimes when it's real cold out, it takes a little while for your heat to work because your engine's cold. Well, this is very similar. The only difference is on an aircraft, the engine doesn't run quite as hot as a car engine, so they've got to pick the point. They've got to pick the point, one of the hotter points of the engine to use, so that your heat coming into the cabin is sufficient to heat the cabin, and so they choose the exhaust manifolds. Can anybody tell me why they think using an exhaust manifold might be a bad idea for a cabin heater?
Carbon monoxide.
Yep, that's exactly right. Yeah, no, that's exactly right. The shroud is a metal device. The exhaust manifold is a metal device, susceptible to rust, etc. And over time, what happens is cracks form in the shroud and cracks form in the exhaust manifold. So if you go flying one day and the airplane you're renting or the flight school you're using doesn't have a carbon monoxide detector in the panel, and it's wintertime and you're going to be using the heater, I would absolutely refuse to fly that airplane. As you guys know, or as you may know, carbon monoxide is a colorless, odorless gas, and you won't even know you're getting poisoned until they count you as a statistic.
So one way to tell is if you start feeling pressure on your chest and you start having audiology hallucinations.
Excellent. No, you're totally right. Yes. Yep.
I only recently learned about that on a podcast, by the way.
Oh, okay. I'm glad you didn't learn it from personal experience.
No. A woman was telling a story on a TED stage about how she thought she had a ghost in her house because she was experiencing these weird pressures on her chest. She was very disoriented. She would hear these auditory hallucinations, and it turns out she was being subjected to carbon monoxide in her house. There was a leak.
Oh,
so once they found out, it completely went away. So it's just, I really heard that like 2 days ago.
Yeah, and I mean, to be honest with you, it's interesting, like for people who have gas utilities in their house. I mean, I know, we had a carbon monoxide detector for a long time. It's the same thing. It's like you might as well have one because it could save your life. So. Yeah. Okay.
Say that it's probably bad. If you're experiencing those things, it's probably too late.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So that's the engine. So I'd mentioned, the engine is a very significant portion of the aircraft. It's got a lot of auxiliary systems on it. And so consequently, it's one of the 2 areas that we're focusing on. The electrical system's the other one. And along with the engine system, the engine electrical system make up the 2, call it significantly primary aircraft systems that you're going to deal with. Today, the general aviation community, you'll see typically 90% of the time a 14-volt direct current electrical system, which comprised of, again, typically a 14-volt alternator, and a 12-volt battery. Very similar to what we all have in our cars. And I say the word typically. Regardless of where you go flying, what airplanes you fly, you're always, always, always going to consult the aircraft operating handbook for the plane you're flying to understand what kind of electrical system it has, or any system for that matter. But in the airplanes that I've flown that you're going to start flying when you start your training, 14-volt direct current system. There are 28-volt systems out there. But 14 volts very common, and the high level components of the system are the master switch, which is your highest level on-off switch for all electrical components in the aircraft. If this switch is off, the entire electrical circuit's cut off. The battery, which provides electrical power for your starter. And in the event that you don't have or lose your alternator or generator, the battery is there to run the entire electronic system. But as you may know, the battery only has so much charge in it. So at some point, that battery is going to run out of juice. That's why your car and your airplane and a lot of different transportation applications, that's why they're outfitted with an alternator or a generator. And what that alternator does is takes mechanical energy from the engine. The alternator is hooked up to the engine. Takes mechanical energy from the engine and turns it into electrical energy. So in short, your battery is used to start your engine. Once your engine is started and running, mechanically turning, it turns your alternator. Your alternator is nothing but a fancy magnet for which a shaft turns in and creates an electrical current. And that electrical current is used to run essentially the entire electrical system of your aircraft. It's also used to charge your battery and keep it at a peak charge level. If you lose your alternator, you have your battery. Your battery will be there to run all the necessary electrical equipment, but it's only going to run while it has a charge. And the 12-volt battery with the amperage requirement of your aircraft is only going to run for about 20 minutes. So not long enough, not long at all. And depending what type of flying you're doing, this could be serious. If you're an instrument-rated pilot flying in instrument conditions, your electrical system is most likely going to be running all of your navigation equipment. So if your alternator fails, you essentially have 20 minutes to get your aircraft on the ground utilizing that navigation equipment while it's still running. The electrical system is split into two different, what they call buses, or you can call them circuits. There's a main circuit and an avionics circuit. Anyone venture a guess why there may be a separate circuit for the avionics?
Because of its criticality? Or maybe it's less critical?
Yeah, it's definitely critical. Yeah, so that is one very good reason. It's a critical circuit because it's got very critical instrumentation on it. And so I'm going to build off of that answer, Alan. I'm going to say that because of its criticality, you want to have the ability to turn it off and on separately for troubleshooting purposes. If you're flying along and you get some indication like on your amp meter that you have a high battery discharge, or you're getting a lot of static in your radios, and you're like, well, shoot, I've got something going on with my electrical system. You can turn that avionics circuit on and off to try your first point of isolating the issue.
Got it.
Yep. And another reason they are on separate circuits is just for load purposes. It happens to be the avionics do happen to be the biggest drain on the electrical circuit. So if you lose an alternator and you need to, conserve battery power, and you have the ability to go without navigational equipment, you can shut off your avionics bus and save some battery, so to speak.
Okay.
All right. Now,
Is that in the main bus goes to the fuel and then you just have a picture of the airplane?
yeah, so I put that up there for lights. So the main bus typically controls the aircraft lighting. Yep. So this is the electrical system. Do you guys notice anything missing from the electrical system that you would think might be there?
Give me just a second. I'm assuming the plane with the lights is to show lights.
Yeah, that's lights. Yep. Mm-hmm.
The fuel pump.
So
Oh,
so that's a good answer. Yeah. The fuel pump is missing from here. Now,
you got a fuel gauge. I think that's what you meant by that.
well, you're right. I mean, the fuel pump. So a non-gravity fed fuel system will have an engine-driven fuel pump, which is driven from the engine, and it will have a backup fuel pump, which is electrically driven. So yes, fuel pump is a good answer. I was looking for a particular answer though. Chris, Emily, any ideas? So in your vehicle, in your car, your ignition system is part of the electrical circuit. And ignition meaning spark plugs. Your distributor and your spark plug circuit is part of your electrical system. If you have a alternator failure or a battery failure in your vehicle, eventually your ignition system will cease to operate, right? In an aircraft, the ignition system is separate from the electrical system. It's a mechanically driven system which is dependent on the engine running for it to operate. Now that sounds like really backwards, right? The engine runs because of the spark plugs. But what I'm proposing here is that the spark plugs actually run because of the engine. Well, the ignition system in piston-driven aircraft are comprised of what's called a magneto, or sometimes you hear it called mags. And a magneto is similar to an alternator, nothing but a fancy magnet for which a shaft passes through that turns. And that shaft is connected to the engine. So the engine turns a shaft, which turns inside a magnet called a magneto, and it creates an electrical field. And that electrical field creates the proper current to run the spark plugs. So it's like a cyclical system. The spark plugs fire the engine. The engine in turn rotates the magneto, and then the magneto continues to provide that spark from that electrical current. Is that clear as mud?
So does the alternator the thing that kicks off the cyclical system, or can you when you hand start a prop?
So so I think what you meant when you said alternator was starter. So the starter kicks.
Sorry. Yeah, thank you. I was thinking starter.
So yeah, so exactly right. So that means so that's the reason you can hand prop an aircraft and start it. You can actually create that mechanical rotation inside the magneto by turning the engine effectively, and thus jumping a spark in one of the cylinders. And if you do it just right, you'll actually start the engine with the prop.
So you remember the Luscombe at my cousin's place? That's how they were started. That's basically the mechanism by which the engine was starting.
That's exactly right. She turned the prop through as many revolutions as she could physically try to turn it. What that did was rotated the shaft in the magneto, which created an electrical field momentarily across the spark plugs, and probably 1 or 2 cylinders fired, and it was just enough to get the engine started.
Got it.
Yep. The starter actually works the same way. It just, instead of using the propeller, it's got a flywheel that is connected to that actually turns the engine.
So maybe not a part of this picture specifically, but on the off, right, left, both start, what do the other things besides start and off mean?
So
both.
Is
it really like right magneto, left magneto? Like why?
Yeah.
Why,
No,
why would you want to
exactly
do one
right.
versus the other? Like,
yeah, that's exactly right. So so there's 2 systems. There's a left system and a right system. They are physically located. The magnetos are physically left and right. And then there's a both setting. So you can run your ignition system with only the left system running, and you can run it with only the right system running, and you can run it with both of them running. Now, your question being like, why would you even give someone the option?
mm-hmm. And what's the difference between both and start? I mean, are those in flight versus engine start?
So similar to your car, the start is the start position is all the way turned where you're engaging your starter, and the both position is when you let go of the key and it kicks back.
Got it.
Yep. Now, the left-right question is a good one. You will not typically, I say typically because it's like, you got to read your operating manual, but you're not going to be running your engine in left mode or right mode while you're flying. Those selectors are there so that when you're on the ground, you can test them independently of one another to ensure that they are both working. Because if one's not working, once you turn it to that inoperative magneto, your engine's going to stop. And you don't want to fly with one magneto just because of the redundancy safety aspect.
Okay.
Yep. Now, another benefit of having 2 magnetos is you've got 2 spark plugs per cylinder, which is just, the aircraft is designed to have 2 spark plugs per cylinder. When you select left or right, you'll notice that the engine runs really rough and it doesn't burn fuel as cleanly.
Cool.
Yep. And, in search of the answer, like, why is this not part of the aircraft electrical system? There aren't like really clean answers out there. You can talk to people, but, my belief is that this is independent of the aircraft's electrical system, just so that when you have an electrical failure, your engine keeps running.
Yeah.
So a lot of trick questions on the FAA written test about that, asking you about electrical failures in engines. And you'll just know that if your electrical system fails, your engine's not going to stop. Your engine will continue to run. Your battery could completely run out, and your alternator could fail. Your battery can completely run out, and your engine will still run.
Cool.
Couple more slides, and then we're going to jump into the video here. Let's time check. We're actually doing okay. Hydraulic system on a general aviation aircraft is extremely, extremely simple. For the airplanes we fly, it's typically just the brakes. And I highlighted this picture here because, when you're flying and you're doing your pre-flight inspections, the hydraulic fittings are some of the most important areas to inspect for conformity, for ensuring that they're tight and torqued. Why? Because as soon as you have a fitting failure and a hydraulic failure, well, in the case of the planes we fly, then you're not going to be able to use the brakes, and you got to find some other method to stop the airplane when you land. Extremely critical aspect of the aircraft hydraulic system. As you go up to more complex aircraft, retractable landing gear typically utilize a hydraulic system. And then your constant speed prop that we talked about earlier, that is considered a hydraulic system. We didn't talk about it really, but it utilizes an oil governor. Utilizes hydraulic oil in a governor to run to change the blade angle. And of course, you get up into your commercial airliners, and hydraulic systems are all over the place. They manage flight controls and control surfaces, flaps, ailerons, and the like. And last but not least on the hierarchy of aircraft systems is your landing gear, your wheels. Brake systems we kind of already talked about, but one other aspect of the hydraulic brake system is, of course, the brakes themselves. Inspecting and ensuring that brake pads are in good fit, form, and function, etc. Landing gear come in different types too. You've got your conventional landing gear, which is your tail dragger. In that configuration, you've got 2 main landing gear and then a wheel in the tail of the aircraft. Then you've got your tricycle gear, which is becoming more popular these days. In that configuration, you've got your main gear and your nose gear. Your third gear is up at the nose. This configuration becomes more popular today because it allows better visibility out of the cockpit. It's also safer. When you're coming into land, you need to brake aggressively. If you're in like snow or rain conditions, you can do so without worrying about nosing the aircraft over. Tricycle landing gear is typically what everybody learns on. Not everybody, but typically. And then you've got different kinds of suspensions. Your Cessna 172 family is going to have what's called a strut suspension system. It's a stiff airframe type suspension strut that provides necessary flexing upon takeoff and landing. It doesn't employ the use of a shock like some cars do. But then you've got airplanes that do have a shock strut type system, like that 737 in the picture on the bottom right. They've got a what's called an oil hydraulic shock strut, which similar to your car cushions the impact of irregularities on the road and of course landing. And then you've got, as far as landing gear goes, retractable versus fixed. Now, fixed is obviously more simple. Everybody typically learns in a fixed gear airplane. And then you've got retractable. It's more complex. You can see that 737, all those hydraulic lines in that wheel well are there solely for the purpose of the retractable landing gear system and the braking system. So you can see the complexity just goes up exponentially when you introduce retractable landing gear systems.
Unbelievable.
Yeah. Okay, so a couple of takeaways. Hopefully I still have everybody. I know it's a lot of information on aircraft systems, but I just want to go over a couple of takeaways because, like I mentioned in the beginning, you're going to go off and learn how to fly, and you're going to get your certificate, start taking your friends and family flying, and it's to some extent it does become about the destination and going from A to B, and some of these items that you learn fundamentally you got to keep up with it or you forget it. But flying does become about listening to and feeling the aircraft, and how it relates to some of the things we learned today. So I made this kind of crude visual, but you've got your pilot and you're flying your airplane. And as far as, engine operation, normal and abnormal operation goes, you're gonna see it, you're gonna feel it, and potentially you're gonna smell it. From the very first day you start flying airplanes, you're gonna be taught how to listen to the engine and what it's giving you from a feedback perspective, from a noise perspective. Does it sound like it's running optimally? You know, does it sound like it's, you know, you can literally hear the difference between a healthy engine as it runs with a proper mixture setting, with a proper fuel to air ratio. You can hear the difference between that and if you've got a too rich of a mixture. It's very easy to hear. Same with too lean of a mixture. Very easy to hear. You're gonna notice it visually with your engine RPMs and your oil temperature and your oil pressure. And you're also gonna feel it. I put a picture of a cockpit down there because sometimes the first thing you notice from a rough running engine is your instrument panel starts shaking. So we talked, you know, there's a lot of fundamental nuances with the operation and the auxiliary systems of an aircraft engine. But from a flying perspective, yes, it is very important to understand those nuances and stay good and studied up on them. But getting a feel, listening to the engine, understanding what the gauges tell you from an oil perspective, an RPM perspective, is really, really critical to being a safe pilot. There is what's really a bummer is it's tough to train on, you know, engine failures that are real, right? Because you learn simulated engine failures, but you're never going to really, you know, learn how to go through a real one until you really do. But it is paramount to learn what the engine's telling you. Same goes for the electrical. You know, the electrical system failures can manifest themselves in different varieties. A staticky radio. You know, all of a sudden your radios are super staticky, which could indicate that there's some electrical nuance or some abnormal electrical field being generated in the aircraft. You do have gauges. You do have your amp meter showing you the current that's going through the system. You know, some aircraft will actually have an indicator that says your alternators failed. Probably by far the biggest indicator of an electrical system failure is a burning smell, and that's what you'll be trained on. Is when you smell something that's burning and it doesn't necessarily smell like burnt engine fuel, you turn your electrical system off immediately and see if it goes away. And if it does go away, you keep your electrical system off and you land. So it's getting to know these different nuances of both the engine and here the electrical system to understand what your airplane's telling you. Your examiner, your FAA examiner, when you go to get your license, will run you through different scenarios. Hey, you're flying at 3,000 feet and you smell something burning. What do you do? You want to kind of think about what the airplane's telling you, and you tell the examiner, well, you know, I'd probably flip my master switch and see if it goes away. And then your examiner is going to say, well, what if your engine's going to die if you turn your master switch off? And you say, no, sir, your ignition system's separate. So it's just important to know the nuances of this stuff is very important. It's important to know what your airplane's telling you visually, by feel, by sense of smell, and the like. These things manifest themselves not only in the gauges, but in what you see, what the airplane tells you, what you hear. So with that, we are up to time. Can we do a time check really quick? Let me get out of here and get back on the video. Do you guys have an extra 10 minutes?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. Emily? All right, let's do this. I'm gonna show video. Actually, let me just let me prime us real quick here. I'm gonna show a couple notes. So I picked out a video this time, and Chris, since this is your first session, what I like to do in these classes is show what they call aviation safety videos. They're case studies put on by AOPA that outline different aviation accidents and the root cause investigation that goes into it. Not because we like to watch dramatic video, but because there truly is something to learn from watching how a pilot handles certain emergency scenarios. So we're going to watch a video today about a instrument pilot who is going on an instrument flight in real instrument conditions to do some practice approaches. And he encounters a aircraft systems issue for which he has to, in a matter of minutes, manage in order to save his life. And I want to brief a couple definitions here, because even though by the end of this course you're going to be familiar with some of these definitions, you may not now. So during the video, you're going to hear a term faulty mag. Well, we know now after today's class that means magneto. And he uses the term faulty mag to indicate that he thinks he has a faulty magneto in his ignition system. You're going to hear the term VFR and IFR, and what those mean are visual flight rules and instrument flight rules, and they simply indicate the type of flying the pilot does. Because he is in bad weather conditions, he is flying in IFR, or instrument flight rules. You're going to hear the controller use the term VFR, visual flight rules, as an indication that he's found an airport for the pilot to land at that has better weather. So just a definition for you there. And mean sea level, MSL. They throw the term MSL around a lot. Mean sea level just means that is the altitude above sea level that the airplane's at. Or if you're talking about the airport, it's the altitude above sea level that the airport's at. So, and another thing, Chris, that we went over last session, our first session, is that video in these particular sharing in Google Hangouts is not good. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ping you guys the link for the video, and I just sent it. It's in the chat. Just confirm receipt if you got that.
Yeah, got it.
Okay, I'm going to go on mute for about 10 minutes. The video is about 10 minutes long. I'm going to watch it myself, and then I'm going to come back. If you guys could just come off mute as an indication that you're done watching the video, and then we'll do a debrief on it. All right, talk to you in 10 minutes. All right. Emily's done. Alan, you done?
Yes, sir.
All right. Chris, are you done?
Yes.
All right.
My name is Jake. I graduated Spartan around 2004, early 2005. Came back to Spartan, became a flight instructor. I've been here for about 2.5 years, almost 3 years now. CFW.
Listen, I think you're still watching a video.
Just over
Am I?
2,500 hours now.
There we
Okay,
go.
there we go. Okay, cool. So that video was interesting, right? Because it required the pilots, obviously it required his extremely quick intuition on what to do. But when you look at the emergency that he had with the aircraft system, with the engine, what was the first thing that he noticed? What was the first sign of trouble?
Shaking of the plane.
Yeah. Right. And like I mentioned before, it's not always a gauge or a smell, but it's like, the instrument panel is going to shake during flight. It's going to vibrate, but just noticing that it's vibrating differently was the first indication. And even though it was about to get a lot worse, the 30 seconds that he saved by noticing the shaking of the instrument panel could have saved his life. And so just going back to the whole point, it's the gauges, it's the smells, it's the feel of the aircraft that'll give you that first indication that something's not right. What did you get? And Chris, you won't get this until we talk about the aerodynamic stuff. But did you guys get the lift drag reference that he mentioned?
Maybe.
Then he positioned it for best glide.
Yeah. So he said he tried to position it for best glide speed.
Oh yeah, he did say that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. But what did you notice? What he said after that? He noticed that when he tried to get best glide, he thought the engine was going to stop completely.
Yeah, that's right. Yep.
So that's something, and again, as you get to fly the airplane more, you'll feel this. But for an airplane that's not producing high power, when effectively his aircraft was idling. If you pull up and slow the aircraft down, the prop is going to, in effect, cause so much drag the engine will stop if he's got an engine issue. So he was very keen to notice that, hey, I can't slow down too much because then the prop's going to stop the engine completely. Did you notice his interactions with air traffic control? How quickly he got and declared an emergency?
Yes.
Yeah, I noticed, more so in this video than most, that, here you've got, and again, we haven't really talked about this yet, but we will. You've got a pilot who's practicing single pilot operations, meaning he doesn't have a co-pilot, but he's utilizing air traffic control as his co-pilot. In other words, hey, I don't have all the faculties right now to navigate and fly the airplane, so I need you to navigate for me. And air traffic control essentially gave him directions, vectors, and told him where to go. And just another note that I think is important, as is in this case, when we're talking about aircraft systems, and we'll touch on this again when we talk about emergencies in a couple classes, engine failures aren't always like the engine stops running completely. Like typically, actually, more often than not, it's the engine is kind of running, or it's half running. Like in his case, he was getting 1,800 RPM, but it certainly wasn't 2,500. It wasn't enough to fly the airplane. So you kind of have to make the decision as a pilot. Well, am I getting enough power to limp along, or should I just shut the engine off completely because it's not like in his case, he was afraid that if he went to best glide, the engine would shut off. And you might argue that he could have maybe traveled further if he was flying at best glide, because as we know, when you're flying at best glide, you get the furthest distance per altitude. And then I know we're very early in our ground school course, but is there anything you guys thought as you were watching that you might have done differently? I mean, anything's fair here. I'm not. No one's gonna judge each other. Did you find anything funny about what he or air traffic control did?
I thought it was interesting at the very end. He said if I had kind of not listened to them, then I would, or not gotten the contrary advice of going to a different airport, then I would have not skidded off the runway, basically. I mean, how do you prevent that? Because I mean, he's in this situation of panic, and he's trying to figure out what's the best thing to do.
Yeah, it's one of those things where when you're mentally and emotionally overloaded, having somebody tell you what to do is almost like the best thing in the world, right? Having someone say, "Hey, just go here," it's like it's automatic. You know, the one thing I think is interesting, as the air traffic controller was trying to convince him to go to the airport with better weather, and we'll talk about this more when we talk about weather, but in reality, from an emergency perspective, the weather might have been better, but it wasn't that much better. It really wasn't that much better to make a huge difference. I think the one thing, as it concerns aircraft systems, just specifically what we've learned today, that you can go back and think about what he did. And you'll learn more of this when we talk about emergencies too. But when you've got the runway made, like he said, he was at a point where he turned base too soon and he had the runway made. And from an aircraft system standpoint, that is the appropriate time to shut off the engine. And why I say that, first of all, he knows he's not going to be able to go around to get full power out of the engine. This landing is his only landing attempt. The engine's still producing power, which is why he said he was floating. But more importantly, if you're going to crash an airplane and the first thing the airplane's going to impact is the front end, you want to make sure that the engine has as little fuel as possible in it. So when you learn your emergency procedures, one of the things you learn is if you're doing an emergency landing and you've got the runway or the flat surface made, you always cut off your fuel supply to the engine. Minimize the explosion or the fire that could happen when you impact anything that's in your way. But that was the only thing I saw. So, all right. So that wraps up the material for today. Did you guys jot anything down or any questions? I did have one thing we can mention real quick that Alan brought up during the video. MVA stands for minimum vectoring altitude. And that is the altitude for which air traffic control doesn't have the tools to give you directions below. So if you're below the minimum vectoring altitude, they will not give you vectors or directions because they don't have their radar capability only goes so low.
Ah, okay.
Yep.
So go ahead.
Yeah. No, go ahead.
This is probably kind of a silly question, but just to be sure, there was obviously some exchanges in there, some understandings of maps and runways, IFR versus VFR runways. I take it through ground school and obviously ultimately flight school, some of this terminology becomes more comfortable, more familiar.
Oh yeah. It's tough because I want to show these videos to show like certain aspects of what we learn, knowing full well that like 80% of the video is a little foreign, and I do apologize about that.
No. I understand VFR, IFR. It's just other things like how recognizing what a runway is. Just some of the things he was saying, which felt like a very comfortable pilot would say.
Yeah. Oh, the whole, and especially the radio lingo and knowing what to say, when to say it, and what to communicate, or maybe even more importantly, how to interpret what somebody's saying to you. That is that's a huge aspect of your private pilot learning, both ground school and flying.
Are there any tools out there that you can use to start getting comfortable with some of those things ahead of time?
Yeah.
Are there how we're watching safety videos, for instance, are there learn how this tower and plane are communicating and what that means, and here's a breakdown? Or, if we're getting to that later, don't worry about it. I'll wait till then. Just curious what's there to help edge some of the learning curve. No,
there's actually, and in fact, it'd be good to start looking at it before we get to it. There's a good website out there, which is It's a conglomerate of air traffic control enthusiasts have come together to create a website called liveatc.net. And it's a portal for which you can plug in your local airport. It's got probably 75% of the airports out there. Plug in your local airport and just listen to radio talk. Whatever's on the frequency, it's live. It's completely live.
Wow.
Yeah, I'll send you guys the link in an email.
Yeah, I have that.
Yep.
Well,
And
and
so Emily mentions that it doesn't necessarily help you learn because you don't learn the terminology. That's a fair statement. I would say the combining a tool like liveatc.net with the section of there's an FAA publication out there called the Airman's Information Manual.
Mm-hmm, the AIM.
The AIM. And there's a whole section on there dedicated to phraseology. Now, it's the reason liveatc.net is nice is because it's, reading that section of the AIM's a little dry, right? It's like 300 pages long, I'm sure. But I think the combination of the ground school session that we're going to do on it, along with the AIM and listening to liveatc.net, that's as much as you can probably do before getting into the airplane.
Okay.
Once you're in the airplane, then it's all about like learning as learning it by trial by error, that kind of thing.
Okay.
So, yeah. And just to wrap that up a little bit, it's when you're in an emergency situation, even when it comes to communication, flying the airplane is paramount to everything else, even communicating. So, any questions on aircraft systems stuff? Did you guys jot anything down from the aircraft systems material that was fuzzy or you wanted to talk about?
No, though I will say that at one point I went and found a YouTube video that showed the mechanical interaction of the multi-pitch prop. I was trying to wrap my head around how that actually worked, and I did finally see the hydraulic and how you push the hydraulic up into that manifold area, and that moves. I'll call it a piston for lack of better engineering terminology. And from that are swing arms that rotate the blades. I was always curious how that worked, like how you manipulated the pitch of a blade when it's spinning at 2,500 RPM.
Oh yeah, it's nuts, right? And thousands of pounds of force on that blade.
Yeah.
Would you want to send that out in the Slack or something we can all see it?
Yeah, let me see if I can find it. I closed it down. No, my history in my YouTube should be there, so I should be able to find it. But yeah, I'll send that out.
Okay. Any questions on the quiz that I sent out? Did you guys have any issues with that? I sent out all the explanations too, but sometimes that gets a little dry to read as well.
No, that kind of stuff's really helpful.
Yep.
So here, if you look in the chat window,
okay,
that's the link.
All right, awesome. Hey, Chris, did you have any questions about the material today?
You're on mute, Chris.
Sorry, not yet. I need to keep on reviewing.
Okay.
And I'll get with you later on to make up the first class.
Yeah, sure. Just let me know what works, and we can go from there.
Yeah.
So,
on that point, what's the schedule for the rest of the classes?
great question.
Excellent. All right, let me share my screen again. All right. Okay. So the schedule I sent out, Alan had sent me some feedback. I also have my own feedback. I actually found a weekend coming up here when I'm out of town. And so basically what I laid out was like a Thursday, Sunday schedule, but not every week would have 2 classes. We would alternate 1 class, 2 class weeks. And this is how it laid out. And so far, I've got July 16 and August 24 as bad dates, for which I just tacked on 2 classes at the end. If this works for everybody, we can put it on our calendars. And then since there's 4 of us, we can, kind of remain slightly flexible. If a couple people come up and say, well, I had some last minute plans and I can propose a new date in the future. Whatever works for you guys. It's a smaller group, so we can stay somewhat flexible.
Sure. I'm I am impartial, so I will yield to those who may have more restrictive scheduling.
Okay. Does the Thursday? I mean, I picked Sunday because sometimes trying to fit 2 evening classes during the week can be like stupid hectic. But I'm the same way. I can, I'm up for whatever you guys want to try to do.
Yeah, no, this really works for me as long as I have it solidified and I know when we're doing it. So, especially since it's online, that's really nice.
Exactly. Let's do this. Alan gave me an August 24 date that didn't work. Emily and my schedules are pretty similar. Chris, do you want to take a look at this and then just shoot me a note if one of these days is not ideal, and then what we'll do is we'll just tack on another class at the end.
Sure, that'd be great.
Awesome. And then I'll make it easy for everybody. I'll send out calendar. I'll set them up on a Google Calendar, and so they'll be there, and everybody will get reminders and stuff.
Cool.
So that means that we're not doing it on the 24th, and the ones where you have parentheses where people are out.
That's the plan. Yeah, we're going to skip those days. And I'm going to, instead of the 16th and 24th, we'll do September 7 and 10.
Okay.
So then, given that, unless I hear back, Thursday 13th, if everybody's open this Thursday, 6 o'clock, does 6 to 8 work for everybody?
Generally, yeah. That's fine.
Yeah, that's great.
Okay. All right. I will, similar to last week, I'll send out a sampling of FAA written test questions regarding aircraft systems. And then several days later, I'll send out the answers. And Slack is always open for crazy airplane discussion if you guys have questions or just want to share some stuff. I think it's a good tool. Anything else, guys?
No, not at this time.
Okay.
Thank you.
Right on. All right, Alan, Chris, Emily, we'll talk throughout the week.
Sounds good.
See you guys.
All right. Bye.